Thanks for joining us. Our guest this week is a Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, former State Representative Leslie Love. Our lead story, legislative Democrats continue to dismantle Governor Rick Snyder's education agenda. On the OTR panel, Kyle Malin, Jonathan Osteen, and Simon Schuster. Sit in with us as we get the inside out, off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Studio C as we move into summer. The legislature is going to get out of town next week. Will that be nice or not? But before they go, the Democrats, it seems to me, Kyle, are systematically trying to send Rick Snyder a message that the stuff he did in office, nobody liked.
Well, at least their supporters don't like, that's for sure. What we're seeing is gradual committee movement on bills that roll back the reforms that him and the Republican legislature put in place, specifically as it relates to teachers and the stuff that teachers can bargain for, whether it's placement, where they are, time off, pay. These types of things are now being put on the table where they weren't on the table before. And also, they're rolling back automatic deductions. If you belong to a union, that can get taken immediately out of your paycheck. The Democrats want to bring this back. An entire laundry list of stuff, and it's keeping the Democratic-controlled legislature busy.
And the Republicans are going, what's happening to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably saw this coming. I mean, Democrats have been doing this all term. I mean, right to work was the biggie. I mean, it stands to reason that they would go after some of the, less sexy but still highly sought after changes by union groups, and that's what they're doing now. One at a time. These teacher, the teacher package. It's a big deal for the public education community. They really want these things to happen. But of course, some of the changes made, like allowing seniority again to be a factor in hiring and firing decisions, is, Republicans contend that's going to make it more difficult for new teachers at a time when the state really needs to be attracting more people to the profession. So, it's the same debate we heard 10 years ago, just in reverse.
Exactly. Nicely put.
Yeah, I mean, organized labor is one of the Democrats' largest constituencies, and they clearly signaled that they wanted to deliver for them should they gain control of Lansing. And I think, when you look at public sector unions in particular, they're not going to be able to reap the same benefits from right to work because of a U.S. Supreme Court decision that auto workers are, for instance. So this is, I think, a really good example of Democrats wanting to nibble around the margins to show, look, we can still deliver for you since you've gone to bat for us in so many instances, even though we can't, provide you the same benefits that we did to other unions.
This seniority piece is an important one, and the education lobby, the SUPs and the local school boards basically are saying, look, if you're a young person coming into our system and we want to keep you, and you can't move up the ladder because you don't have seniority, that's a deterrent. The other side says seniority has always been a part of union contracts, and we're talking to those young people to try to ameliorate that problem. But that is a problem for the Republicans and the school boards and the SUPs.
For 10 years, Rick Snyder and the Republican legislature was trying to make performance-based improvements, or, if you're good in the classroom, then you should be getting the pay raises. You should be getting the prime spots, the prime teaching spots. And the unions were saying the seniority has to be part of the equation. Well, when they were in the minority, they didn't get any kind of consideration on that. Well, now that they're in the majority, they're trying to put seniority back on the table, because their thing is, if you've been in the classroom 15, 20 years, you've got experience to be able to handle some of these classroom dynamics that maybe somebody who's only been there 2 years can't do. But also, you got to keep in mind, too, who are the members of unions, and the people who are in power are the people who have seniority. The people who have say in the unions are the people who have seniority. So those are the issues that are going to be put front and center in front of Democratic legislators.
The SUPs would counter. Let's say we've got a freshman English class of kids that are not doing well. I'd like to put one of my seasoned professors in that class to help. And what does the senior faculty member say? I'm not teaching that class. That's what the SUPs are saying, and that's the dynamic that goes on. Is that a fair argument or not?
Yeah, I mean, that one particular issue is a sticking point here. I mean, typically you see Democrats doing things that the education community writ large, the public education community, I should say, does like. But there was some pretty significant pushback. I mean, Bob McCann, former aide to now Governor Whitmer, put out a pretty scathing statement for an alliance of education administrators that he represents about this package. So certainly it did, clear the House this week, but there's going to be some more debate on that moving forward.
All right, let's talk about the 3 people that have been arrested, or at least 2 of the 3 arrested on felony charges. They think they found the culprits who got all those petition signatures wrong.
Yeah, I mean, this is an investigation that's been going on for more than a year. And so I think even at the onset of this, looking at the petition signatures, we know what firms were sort of, driving these. And so I think this was really a matter for the Attorney General to sort of establish what kind of charges they could bring and whether they had the necessary evidence to bring those charges. And I mean, this was a political scandal on a degree that rocked, I think, Michigan politics beyond what we've seen in decades.
Yeah, let's just remember for folks at home, I mean, this is the signature fraud scandal from a year ago that kicked 5 Republican gubernatorial, half the Republican field, including the presumed front runners, early front runners, James Craig and Perry Johnson, who's now running for president, kicked him right off the ballot. So this was a huge deal a year ago, and it's a pretty big deal now because you don't often see major charges in petition circulation fraud. Like, usually you'd go after the circulator maybe and, a slap on the wrist or something. But this is going after the organizers, the folks who owned the firms who, according to Attorney General Dana Nessel, allegedly knew about the fraud, and allowed it to happen and duped these candidates. It's important to note that there's been a lot of people blaming the candidates, and Attorney General Nessel did say, please vet firms before you hire them. You could have Googled Sean Wilmoth, one of the guys arrested, and see who was indicted charged with fraud. Pled guilty to fraud a decade ago for similar reasons. But at the same time, she did clearly identify the candidates as victims here, folks who were taken for a ride by these signature gathering companies.
Which is an understatement.
Yeah, I think what also is notable that there was several other people who were involved in this kind of round-robin scheme where they took people's petitions and they went around the table and they tried to put in different signatures of different people, basically pulling the names out of the phone book. But only 3 people were charged, which tells you, or tells me anyway, that some of these people who were around the table are collaborating to get after the big fish, the person who was in charge, who was, as Jonathan said, pled guilty in Virginia for something very similar. So they're going after, they're really getting to the head of the dragon, I suppose, or the head of the snake, and going after them with these charges.
I would make one correction. Last week on the program, I said that James Craig and others don't have to collect petition signatures to run for the U.S. Senate. I'm told that is incorrect, but it's not as many as they had needed under this particular thing. All right,
yeah.
One other quick thing. Did you know in Michigan that if you were 13 years old, you could get married, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, there was no minimum age up until the legislation that was passed by both chambers of the legislature this past week. And so, I mean, this was something that seemed relatively uncontroversial at the outset. It's something where
it was going on.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's obviously a number of people who had been former child brides testified in support of, banning this practice. And this is something that I think people found, when they were made aware of it, pretty egregious.
I think what we may not realize here is that there is, first of all, there's a religious element, and there's kind of a cultural element that if a girl gets pregnant at 16 and the father is a 17-year-old, that they have to get married, and there's like this shotgun wedding thing taking place, and that's kind of how society way back when was and how we should continue things. But there's a legal problem with getting married at 16. You don't have the rights that you do at 18. So getting a divorce or finding a hotel room or getting services or getting state help become real difficult. I mean, you
Personal
can't,
protection orders.
You can't do these kind of things, Jonathan, when you're 16, 17 years old. And I think that's information that really didn't sink in maybe to folks on the Republican side of the aisle when these bills were brought up 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago. And now that the Democrats are in charge and they can shine a spotlight on it, you saw Republicans not only support these bills, but sponsor some of these bills, and then them go ahead and pass overwhelmingly.
Yeah, I mean, the advocates for this change point to research showing that people who get married before they're 18 often, not always, but often are forced into that either by circumstance or parental desires. I mean, to get married under 18, you needed parental approval in Michigan. To get married under 16, you need parental approval and judicial approval. So it's not like it could just automatically happen, but who's to say those parents weren't pressuring a child because of some reason that the child, through no fault of their own, to get married? We know that there are about 5,000 marriages over the last 2 decades in Michigan, so it's not a huge number. But most of those involve girls, meaning females under 18, and adult men. It's girls who are forced into these relationships most often.
All right, quickly, Simon, on implementation of Proposal 1, which was the vast election reform stuff, quick update on where we are.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a level of engagement from Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson that we have not seen on other issues in the past. She's gone before the legislature repeatedly to say, here's my wish list of the things that I want to make happen, and I want to make sure that I have the funding to actually enforce financial disclosure requirements that voters passed overwhelmingly in Proposal 1. And that if that doesn't happen, it seems like she has real concerns about the effectiveness of this proposal when it is implemented.
Is she concerned that the Ds are not going to deliver?
I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now, just because there's been a lack of details. There's been so much on the Democratic agenda here that we don't really have a good sense of what this is actually going to look like when we see a line-by-line implementation of what's required.
It's one thing to talk about financial disclosure. It's another thing to actually do it.
Yeah, I know, because the people that this applies to are the people who are actually passing the laws.
Exactly.
Do I really want to do this?
We're talking about me.
Yeah. And since, as Simon said, there's so many things on the agenda, how do you fit this in? How do you fit the financial disclosure in that was put in place by Proposal 1 but still needs implementation language?
Listen, that has to be done by the end of the year or the state can be sued. So, I mean, there's an impetus to get that done. The question is whether Democrats are going to package that with other reforms and make a larger, FOIA, for instance, the Freedom of Information Act, expanding that to the legislature and governor's office. That's part of the discussion here, to potentially do a large package. But, not a lot of time in the grand scheme of legislating with summer break coming up to get this all done by the end
and
of
I
the
think
year.
an important part here, too, is that, we're working on a budget that has to be done relatively soon, and that they're also appropriating money for implementing these programs when they don't know exactly how broad or how
Well, and
extensive they
let's
want
not
them
lose
to be.
sight of the fact that this package, when it started out, was watered down by the legislature. They say, here, we'll make a deal with you, special interest groups. You don't have to do a petition drive. We'll do it for you. Oh, but by the way, some of the more stringent reforms you got in there, we're going to kind of water them down. So that was a precursor of things to come.
Yeah, things like getting rid of the revolving door, going from the legislature to the
Or using the
lobbying court.
congressional disclosure thing, which is a little more insightful as to what your finances are.
Yeah, and we don't know what's going to end up. We know that some of these things, like the revolving doors, have been around since time begot. They never do anything about it.
Since lawmakers became lobbyists.
as long as term limits chased one from one career to the other.
All right, let's at this point call in our guest today, Leslie Love, who is a Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, former representative. Nice to see you on our program. Let me start with the obvious question. Do you think somebody in the Democratic Party is trying to ordain Alyssa Slotkin as the nominee for this job, and why are you smiling?
Good morning, because I'm with you, the dean of political reporting.
Yeah, that and 25 cents you could buy a cup of coffee. Please, the question at hand, Representative.
There definitely seems to be a predetermined establishment candidate present, and I think this is a very interesting and pivotal point in the history of Michigan politics right now. And it's why I decided to run for office. So, yes.
Well, some would say we want to predetermine it because we want to win the seat.
Well, you know how you win the seat? By giving voters an option and allowing us to have an opportunity, us being the Michiganders, to weigh in and voice our opinion. You just can't put a backpack of millions of dollars on someone and say, here, vote for this person. There are a lot of voices in Michigan, and I represent a voice that is being lost in the political conversation from the state of Michigan and Washington, D.C. Representation matters. And I represent the middle class, a very shrinking group of folks, working class people, in not only in Michigan, but in our nation. That's important that that representation is at the table. It's important that representation that looks like me is at the table, that has this type of real lived life experience that so many Michiganders have had, just dreamers and people who've worked really hard, knuckles deep into their beliefs and values, and forge forward, moving to do the things that they believe in. And so all of those things are on this ballot for this Senate election.
Well, Representative, to that point, Congress people from Detroit right now, Shri Tanadar, Rashida Tlaib, they're people of color, but they're not African American. They're not black. How big of a deal is that to voters there? And do Democrats really risk losing enthusiasm if they have another white candidate, in this case, at the top of the ticket?
You know, what Michigan has been able to do, particularly out of Southeast Michigan, is bring a delegation of diversity. And for the first time in the history that I can remember of my life, is that we don't have someone that looks like me in our United States Congress. That's problematic. If you just realize, we just celebrated Juneteenth, and for the first time our nation made it a national holiday. We would not have a United States of America without Black people's contribution to ending the Civil War. And so our voice, our place in this conversation is still very much relevant and very important. And I think all the diverse voices are. And Michigan is pretty good at sending a dynamic, diverse delegation, but something is obviously missing. And I just want to point out, it's not just that I'm Black or that I'm a woman. I'm also from Southeast Michigan, the largest economic engine region in the state of Michigan. It's important that we have representation out of Southeast Michigan. It's important that we have representation from the middle class, and that we have someone who really is from the people, grew up grassroots, who's serving in this position. And so I think all of those things are important for voters and what will motivate a base to come out.
Ms. Love, we've heard for years that the Democratic Party is taking for granted the African-American vote. Do you feel like it's gotten better? You feel like it's gotten worse? You feel like it's stayed the same?
Well, we're having this conversation. The first question, how we started off, that is there an heir apparent? You know, the deal was already done. The field was allegedly cleared. And I said, not so fast. There are other voices here that have something to offer to this conversation so that voters will have a choice. And that's what I represent in this conversation, an experienced lawmaker, very successful and working across the aisle, and is known for that. And I think that just really matters. At this point in time in our life, we cannot ignore the obvious. We just came out of the pandemic. We're seeing the type of violence in America, in Michigan, that's unprecedented. And these are all our mental health issues. We have an issue with immigration. We have what I call a human resource issue of where are the people, where are our workers, whether they're teachers or healthcare workers. And so this is what we're talking about, the middle class that is shrinking in our society. And I'm here to represent that.
Well, to get back to the question then, is the Democratic Party taking African-American voters for granted? Let me try it that way.
I think absolutely.
Okay.
That has happened. You know, you can't shove a candidate before people and say, hey, this is this person, vote for her or vote for him. And it's like, okay, why? And there's no choice. And then it's a big push. You know, we need to have African Americans need to come out and vote. For what? You've already made the decision for us. And so now with having candidates like me in the race allows people, especially Black folks, an option. All we want is to be able to vet our candidates, understand who they are, and make an informed and intelligent choice. And don't take it for granted. that we want to show up when you just tell us who to vote for. We want options. We want the ability to decide for ourselves and vet our own candidates.
Yeah, if there is an heir apparent in this race, that individual in Representative Slotkin has proven that she can raise millions and millions of dollars. She's ran, in times the most expensive U.S. House races in Michigan's history. How, if there's going to be an alternative to her message that's going to pose a real threat in a competitive primary that the field just keeps growing, how is that person going to rise above those other voices?
Well, I think we have to move this conversation beyond money. Of course, it costs money to run a campaign. Running for U.S. Senate is a very expensive endeavor. But if we make this about money, then we can slap a backpack of $1 million on any individual and run that person, and they become our U.S. Senator or Congressperson. It has to be deeper and more relevant and strike at the core of our values as Michiganders and as Americans, like what the people say. A people's movement is much greater than any amount of money one candidate can raise. And so what I hope that happens, that people realize that we're at a point in our lives in America where, and I cannot say this enough, the middle class is diminishing. You have so much, there's the haves and the have-nots. And whether it's new technology, even the people who create artificial intelligence are saying, hey, we need some parameters on what we're doing and what we're creating here. And what will eventually happen is that we'll have those who are extremely wealthy and those who are extremely poor. And so when candidates campaign on working class but aren't from the working class, who don't know what that struggle really feels like, it's a real disconnect. And I've done that from being the waitress to being in the C-suite. So I have a unique understanding and knowledge and experience and an open mind and heart to understand the experience and to serve and offer a unique perspective in this conversation.
Representative, in light of that statement, if Elissa Slotkin eventually gets the nomination, would you support her?
Well, let's see if she gets the nomination. I think Elissa Slotkin and I come from very different points of view. And that's what makes us interesting and competitive.
Which is why I'm asking the question, because there are differences there. And at the end of the day, would you be comfortable voting for her?
Well, we'll find out when that end of the day comes. What I hope at the end of the day is that I'm the candidate that Elissa Slotkin has to answer that question. Will I vote for her? Of course, I want a Democrat to keep this seat, but I want a Democrat that really celebrates and upholds democratic values. I don't want a light blue Democrat. Where's your conversation on the middle class? Where's the conversation on immigration? Where's the conversation on minority engagement and contracts for small and minority businesses? Don't talk to me just because you're running for office, but in everything you do as a sitting Congressperson that says you care about minorities, you care about immigrants, you care about women's rights, that you can speak on those issues. It took Elissa Slotkin, when she ran for Congress, she brought this up earlier, 5 times the amount of money her Republican competitor raised and spent to win. She's an expensive candidate for Democrats. I think when you put an exciting candidate, a motivated candidate like Leslie Love, it changes the trajectory. It moves the conversation beyond me as a person, because this isn't about Leslie Love. What's on the ballot is our values. It's what we believe in as Michiganders. It's an opportunity for dreamers and visionaries, for the underdog to have a space at the table. That's what's on the ballot, not just Leslie Love. This is so much bigger than an Elissa Slotkin or Leslie Love or any of the other candidates who are looking at this position. We have to understand the unique moment and hour that we're in.
Changing the subject just a little bit here. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court said that Alabama had to redraw its congressional maps because there were not enough districts that represented a majority of African-American voters. Do you feel like the maps in Michigan, either on Congress, state Senate, or state House, are at risk? Are these things that should be looked at in light of this Alabama decision?
our maps in Michigan, just in Southeast Michigan, are so horribly gerrymandered that inside politics, it's a joke that, if the politicians would have drawn these lines, they wouldn't have hurt Detroit as bad as they did. It's pretty awful. When you look at, for example, this is a perfect example, the Detroit delegation. What Southeast Michigan is known for is creating diversity in the state legislature. The Detroit delegation, almost half of those members don't live in Detroit, and in fact, they live in Oakland County. And imagine if Elle Brooks was still alive right now, how that competition for resources for the state's largest city would be, and how that conversation would change, and so it matters, this district, and I think what the mayor Mayor Duggan has done to challenge the census count is all right and in order.
Representative, thank you for being on our program. You'll keep us in touch on your campaign, please.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Tim. And I hope that your viewers will go to my website, loveformichigan.com, to read more about me.
Thank you very much. Before we close off the show tonight, we have a little business to take care of. WKAR-TV was recently awarded an Emmy for the program Evening with the Governor. And so it would be appropriate that we thank Governor Gretchen Whitmer and First Gentleman Dr. Mark Mallory for their participation, because without them, it would have been an Evening with Skubik, which would not have gotten an Emmy. We also, in these closed credits, want to thank some other folks who made this possible. See you next week right here on Off the Record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan Public Television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.
Others who made the Emmy possible include station manager Sean Turner and his talented executive team. Key production contributors include Tim Elkins, Ken Murley, Drew Hill, and Rob Sumler. And thanks to the Michigan Academy of Television Arts and Science for this honor. See you next week.